that you can see that we are recording somewhere?
Yes, now, I think.
Now.
Yeah.
Good. So now I am counting on that we are actually recording. So, hi, Gill.
Hi, Julie.
It's so good to see you. Welcome to this talk that we are doing because of the International Women's Day, which is tomorrow. Here in Denmark, it is Sunday morning, and in New Zealand, where you are, it's Sunday evening, right?
Yes.
Yes, we have exactly 12 hours time difference. So, but for all of you who are watching, let me present Gill Gatfield. Gill Gatfield, who you can see in front of you, is a visual artist from New Zealand. She is also educated in laws, but Gill is what I define as an activist, an artist who is also an activist. And I know Gill because 5 years ago, she was artist in residence in Aarhus at the Women's Museum, which is now called Gender Museum Denmark. And it was such a pleasure to know you, Gill. And Gill and I, we installed an artwork at the museum, which is called Glass Ceiling. It's of course your artwork, but I helped smash a lot of glass, and I remember that a lot. You are welcome to talk about that as well if you like. But it was such a special time. It was in 2015. It was the year of the 100 years anniversary for Danish women's right to vote. And the reason why I've asked you to do this talk is because Denmark is really looking at New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand was also the first country in the world who had women's right to vote. I think it was in 1893 that women gained the right to vote in New Zealand. And also your Prime Minister, you have done some remarkable things concerning gender equality, and that's what I would like to talk about today, among other stuff. So this is a kind of a report from down under. So very nice to have you here, Gill.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you. But also, of course, I hold Kvindemuseet and now the Con Museum, close to my heart. I've been very impressed with the work that the museum is doing, and the quality of the programs, just the way that you approach things. It's interesting because in New Zealand we hold that in high regard. So it's interesting how from different perspectives we watch what each is doing in other countries in the feminist movement and gender movement. So it's we don't have a women's museum, so we have you on a pedestal. So it is an honor to be able to talk with you today. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Gill. So I think I would like to start with the gender pay gap thing, because in Denmark we really have our eyes on the gender pay gap, especially now. It's COVID-19. We are in a time of crisis, and of course Denmark we have an equal pay bill, but in praxis we have still a gender gap that is remarkable, and we have really discussed this in Denmark during these times where you really see the need for nurses at the hospitals, and you really get your eyes fixed on this very divided work labor in Denmark. I mean, We have a really divided workforce. We have a really divided educational system. And we can see that reflected in the gender pay gap. And could you tell me a bit more about this Equal Pay Amendment Act that was passed in 2020? And could you tell me about the, what is the scope and why was the law changed in the first place?
Yes. So New Zealand introduced equal pay law first in 1972. So at that stage, there was recognition with the women's movement creating the impetus that women's work was not paid equally when doing the same work. So we got that baseline covered in 1972. And what was really apparent even then, but more so as time went on, was that women's work was undervalued generally because of gender discrimination. So we had a very historic case before the courts here that was started in 2014 and was completed a couple of years later. And that case was claiming for equal pay for work of equal value for women who were working, for example, in the home care sector. So they were working partly for the government and going into people's homes and caring for them. And they might have been recovering from an injury or an illness. And that those predominantly female workers were being paid less than predominantly male workers in an equivalent sector. So, for example, those who work in the prisons, the men, who are many of those are men, and they were being paid a lot more for their work than the women who were going into homes. So the historic discrimination that set the pay rates differently was challenged in the courts, and the women advocates won. What that meant was that thousands and thousands, like something like 50,000 women workers were going to suddenly get this massive pay increase. And the government realised that that was going to be quite chaotic. So it stepped in and has implemented a law change to make it very clear that where there has been historic gender bias and there is a difference in the pay rate, regardless of the skills being very similar, the conditions being similar, the experience needed being similar, just the type of work being so comparable, it wasn't able to be justified that women would be paid less. So the law's been changed to make it very clear, but mostly so that women's organisations and the unions don't have to go through the courts for years and years and years to get the right outcome. So it's a pragmatic law change. It will apply mostly to organised work groups. So those who have union representation, like I'm not sure how that translates into Danish.
Yes. Yes,
yeah.
translate.
So those groups are now given a much shorter process of how they can actually get that outcome based on gender, which is really great. Now, there are, of course, limitations because there are sectors that fall outside that law, like, for example, the arts sector. So arts and culture, right, where we have mostly part-time or contract workers or people who have to do very piecemeal jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, women are highly represented, for example, as dancers, right? Or as it happens, as painters. And there is no representation, we have no union for our arts workers. So that kind of group will fall right outside this new law. So it's really good if you're in an organised employment group, but if you're in a fragmented employment group, it's not so good. And with COVID, what's happened is that we have huge unemployment for women because the sectors that have been hardest hit are those which women are working in a lot. Hospitality,
yes,
tourism, childcare, because people can't send their children to the childcare centres. There are a lot of impacts more on women and women's work, if there's such a thing, as we're now trying to change it. It's kind of almost pushing it back. So we've got this gain that's happened, and then we've got the slide. You know, we've got the impact of the economic fallout of the pandemic. So those are some of the things which are happening here, which are very, you know, people are aware of them. There's not necessarily the ability to respond as quickly as organisations might like to. But there's a high level of awareness in New Zealand. You know, it's talked about quite a lot. The government's doing something very good, which is to start talking about fair pay agreements. So we've now got pay equity for organised groups. Fair pay agreements would actually set the conditions and the pay for groups of workers who've been undervalued generally. So maybe like cleaners, you know, again, many of whom will be women. So groups where they haven't got good bargaining power with employers. So those groups will come under, if this law comes through, they'll come under a new system where their basic terms and conditions will be set at a minimum. So they won't get below a particular wage, or they won't have to work more than a certain type of hours or in a certain type of condition. This will be a very good outcome, because one thing we also have here is that our pay inequity, the pay gap, impacts greater on Māori and Pacifica people. So our minority ethnic groups are less, you know, represented in these sorts of improvements. There's been much more historic discrimination. So, so this is a good thing, to actually make it about conditions generally, not about gender specifically, but both. Because they will often encompass both.
That's a good point. And I think it's also a very good point, you know, the awareness issue, because the thing that people are discussing this and becoming aware of why society is built the way it is, it's so important. And the historic view is so important to have as well. And that's also a thing that we are discussing in Denmark, you know, why the unions and why things has you know, been built on inequity in the first place. It's interesting what you're saying about the Indigenous people of New Zealand, and I would like to hear more about that. How are they organizing in terms of gender equality, the fight for gender equality?
Yeah, we have a very historic challenge that's occurring. It's probably the best description for it, by Māori women, and it's called mana wahine. Mana means having power or standing, having status, and also having presence, being of a particular, being recognised as having that power. And wahine means women in Māori. So mana wahine is this big claim that's being run by Māori women to get the crown, which is the sort of the representative of the colonising process that we've gone through here. So the crown being the British crown, but now the crown in New Zealand is its own legal entity. So Māori women are getting the crown to listen to the effects of colonisation on their status, on their legal status, their economic status, their personal status, their relationship with land, their status within their own tribes, which are called iwi. So this is a very big almost like national claim that is being lodged, and the voices that are coming through, and the the stories that will be told will be extremely powerful and important, because we're still in a process here of working through our obligations to each other as two different groups that came together and made an agreement called the Treaty of Waitangi. And that treaty, which is now over 150 years old, that treaty is the basic principles upon which Māori agreed to share their land with Europeans who came, from England and Scotland and Ireland and other places. But that agreement was not upheld. So we're going through a very long process, but probably now sort of 3 decades, where we're sorting out the effects of that, and the government is stepping up and contributing and doing land transactions and giving apologies and recognising that rights have been incorrectly taken away. So what's exciting for women to have this mana wahine claim is to actually have Indigenous women's voices now at the forefront of what is needed to rectify, to repair what has been happening for, 160-something years for them, because women in Māoridom are held very high, there's a very high regard, and traditionally was based on equality. So it was all about different roles and different responsibilities, but all equal, unlike in European cultures where European men tended to be more powerful and European women, and it's always been about trying to get to equal, right?
Yeah.
And when colonization happened here, the European government system actually took Māori women's rights away from them. So where they were equal, they suddenly became less than their own men. So this was a loss, a really great loss. So we have a lot to learn from, this process that we're going to go through next. It's pretty exciting. I think it's internationally, really could be a really great role model for what could happen, across the globe.
It's very interesting, that one system takes over another and smash that equality. I think it's a very interesting example. How is the gender equality picture like in other ways in New Zealand? I mean, do you see any specific areas where you would like to point out, here we need some work? Because I would like to look at it together with the Danish system.
Right. Okay. So we still have high levels of violence against women and children. So that is, that's, I guess, a way that the power imbalance has been sustained, within households, a lot of family violence, as well as, stranger violence. So, that is something we need to have a lot more attention paid to. I think also, how women are positioned in terms of leadership and decision-making roles. We uphold our, wonderful Prime Minister, and we recognise too that, our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is actually the 3rd woman Prime Minister in New Zealand. So we're very, proud of we have a legacy of women taking strong leadership positions.
Do you think that is important? Do you think the gender of a Prime Minister is important in terms of, doing something about gender inequality?
Yes, I do, because each of our women Prime Ministers has done so. So the proof is in the pudding, we would say here.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think just the example of having a child while you're in office and, you know, being seen to be a parent,
Yes.
and recognizing the needs and interests of parents, you know, is new. With you know, across governments, you know, worldwide, this is a change that we're seeing.
Yes.
And I think also a sensitivity and compassion for groups who haven't had and held power, you know, traditionally, or haven't had access to opportunities. I think the three women prime ministers that we've had have all been quite exceptional in, you know, leading this kind of change. At the moment, the two leaders of our two main political parties are both women. So, you know, we kind of got that, but what we don't have is necessarily that translating across all organisations. So in our boardrooms, in our corporate sector, we have, I think it's, you know, it depends, but it's around, you know, late teens to early 20s percentage of women on boards. We're talking about having a quota for women on boards, and you know, this would be something that New Zealand hasn't done yet, not formally. So this is something which they've implemented in Australia and are having quite a bit of success with, getting women onto boards. That's in the private sector. In the public sector, it's actually a requirement to have representation of Māori, Pacific Island, other ethnic minority groups, women, and people from disability communities. So there's the government in its own management and its own boards that are set up to run many things, is always leading, but the private sector is lagging behind. And, you know, where we want change and where the women's groups are really activating is in the private sector to get more women into decision-making positions, because we're backing women to implement change that is good for all people, for all genders. You know, we're not putting women there to advance women, we're putting women there to advance a better way forward for everybody.
Yeah.
So the groups, there's just like some amazing, powerful groups that are promoting this. So Global Women is an organisation that I am part of, and it's, you know, constantly activating, you know, constantly looking for ways to achieve those kinds of outcomes. SheEO is another really interesting group that's funding women entrepreneurs. You can have SheEO in Denmark. It's so interesting. So women actually coming up with their own business ideas and solutions to tomorrow's problems, right? Yes. So that we can have a better future for everyone again. So these kinds of groups, we have really, really strong women's organisations in New Zealand, and they're very embraced and supported. And for young women, we have what we call the YWCA, and that's a very, very strong organisation. Lots and lots and lots of groups that all talk to each other, you know, and keep pushing and keep the conversation going.
It's so inspiring to hear about. I think it's very similar in Denmark, what you're talking about in terms of women in boards. You know, the private sector is really falling behind, but the important thing to start with is to have the role models, and I think we really are in a wave of change these years, and you are, especially in New Zealand, but we are too in Denmark. So many things is happening, and I also find that there are strong organizations in Denmark, but it's you need to keep pushing. You need to keep on making this awareness. I don't know how the picture is in New Zealand, but in Denmark we recently had our, you know, real Me Too wave, because when the Me Too movement was apparent all over the world in 2017, it was quite invisible in Denmark actually, but last year, in the fall last year, it really kind of exploded in Denmark. and we had the Me Too movement, but also we implemented a law of consent in terms of the sexual consent law, and what I am very aware of is we have to keep on making these things visible, and it cannot, fade out. The wave cannot fade. We have to keep on discussing it, because there's so much work to do. But it's very inspiring to hear you speaking, and I think it's very important for countries to look at each other and find the good examples and think, oh, we can take that example and implement that. I mean, you don't have to invent everything yourself. So I feel very hopeful speaking to you in a way. Yeah. But we also have, I mean, the gender-based violence issue. It's a huge problem in Denmark as well, and I think that's really one area that is it's really taboo. It's really hidden away. It's difficult to really get out in the open. I mean, Me Too, it's easier in a way, but the violence thing, which is so it's such a problem, and it's so gender related. I mean, it is men committing violence against women primarily, but people, it's so hard to talk about. There's really kind of resistance every time it's going on, but it's such an important area. So I think that when you are comparing Denmark to New Zealand, I think the picture is quite the same, but I still think that you are 2 steps ahead. How do you see the next 10 years? Do you see any, concrete improvements, concrete new legislations, or, for example, the quota things? The thing could that be
the what? Sorry,
the quota for
quota, yes.
Quoting, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I think the big picture that may provide the impetus for some more enduring change is to do the rethinking on gender, taking the impetus away from it being women's issues to being gender issues.
Yes.
I know you've had a name change recently, and I've thought quite a bit about that and done some reading around that, and we've had these conversations here. We still tend to talk about women's issues. We still tend to talk about the women's movement, and yeah, and these are good things, and it's not to lose, these strong momentum forces, but at the same time, it is really important to include men, and we do know that so many men and so many gender diverse people agree and want to see equity and equality and diversity and inclusion. So, these are the touchstones that I think if we can embrace more activators, more men particularly, then and make the movement wider, because the outcomes are wider. So from my perspective, we keep having gains and then we have losses, right? Because when there's a pandemic, the women lose their jobs and the women end up suffering more violence, so, and then we might have a war, and, these are the things that have happened across time through particularly European, Western societies and economies. So we need to change something at a much deeper level if we've got the opportunity to not have to just keep going round, and keep having to have the next wave of like Me Too, right?
Yeah.
I wrote a book now nearly 30 years ago, and I wrote about sexual harassment and sexual assault in the legal profession, not just in New Zealand, but across the globe, and and that this was not okay. And it was about 30% of the women in the profession were experiencing sexual harassment or had experienced sexual harassment. So now 30 years later, you know, we had a big Me Too moment here where they did another survey and found 30% of women in the legal profession were experiencing sexual harassment. This is not good enough. You know, this is a continuum of impacts, and we might have this, but it's not okay to keep throwing more women at the problem, to experience it, to then have to activate to change it. So I think there needs to be a total seed change.
Yes.
There needs to be a massive pivot, you know, of who is behind the change, because who are the beneficiaries of that?
Yeah.
I loved it. It was in Iceland where all the women didn't go to work for the day.
Yes.
You know, I think things like that is so good. We should do that. Because it's really,
I really agree with you, and the whole, you know, the whole point about the women's museum, you know, broadening the vision, the responsibility is really to work with what you're saying, to manifest that it cannot be a women's issue. This is a common culture that we need to change, and we need to stand together. We need to have more men being aware of, you know, the fight that women have fought and are still fighting. We have to have the men also to be aware of the fact that they are gendered individuals, because it is in the relation that things are going on. And that's really part of the vision, but it has been a hard change for the museum. But I can really feel that it is important. It's actually an activist statement to change the name. It's really to set a new normal, because I think it's so interesting what you're saying. You know, we have had the waves, and of course we are moving forward, but it's going so slowly. And I hear, you know, some of my heroes from the 1970s women's movement, they tell me, oh, when we talk about, for example, sexual harassment or other gender equality issues, they say, Julie, we talked about this 50 years ago. It was the same discussions. Why are we not, you know, changing the scope? Why are we not changing the rhetoric? Why is it still women against men like this? How can we do something about it? So yeah, we need to make these waves be bigger and longer in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. That's right. We're looking for this lovely even ground.
Yeah, it's out there somewhere.
No, I think it's coming, and I think that, you know, if you look at the protests and see how many young men are participating and supporting and being vocal, you know, I think that the change is happening anyway, and it's also fortunately being enabled by technology, because technology is a great democratizer. You know, those who have access to information and to opportunities, you know, it's changed because of technology. So what used to be before, just as an example, in a workplace where you got tapped on the shoulder to get an opportunity, you know, you now actually have it online, and it's open often. And so women can apply, and people with disabilities can apply, and people for whom English is not a first language, if you're here, can apply. You know, technology will play a big part, and has done so far, but will continue, I think, to enable movements to gain ground, like Me Too, like Black Lives Matter. You know, this is a really empowering time.
It is.
Of course, it's not always used for good. It's used it's used to close down democratic processes. But I think there's enough, you know, there's enough goodness and goodwill towards others. You know, humanity's not lost its humanity, right? There's still a desire to want to behave in a collective manner for the greater good or the common good. So, I think that we're at a really special moment going forward with this big pool of aware young people, both men and women, and gender diverse, and people with disabilities, and people from ethnic minorities, and migrants, and it just goes on, and older people who are also embracing technology. Yes. And I think that this is the path forward, and I am optimistic. I think that we can change what's gone on in the past and not repeat that wave. We can actually have a trajectory to it being truly a parallel position for everyone, because we're no longer talking about women versus men, right? We're talking about diversity and inclusion, and we're not talking about equality, we're talking about equity. Yes. And that's probably just back to the beginning of the Equal Pay Act. That change that's come in here now is actually about pay equity. So now we're talking about the real stuff. We're talking about the outcomes. We're not talking about it looking equal on paper. We're talking about the actual outcomes. Are the outcomes comparably the same? And can you evaluate that? And also, in our case now with this new law, historic sex discrimination is one of the factors that has to be taken into account when deciding what is equitable. So, I think we're good.
It's so good to be optimistic. I think to really make change, you need to be able to imagining a better future. So you have to be an optimist. So we have to speak and make the words of the future, I think. So it's I feel very hopeful, and it's so great to talk to you. We have to end our talk soon, but we could keep going on. But towards the end, I would just like to ask you, how are you celebrating tomorrow, the International Women's Day, and how are you personally celebrating, and how is New Zealand celebrating?
Okay,
can you tell that it's International Women's Day tomorrow?
Well, it's not here tomorrow. It's on Wednesday, I think, here.
Wednesday.
So yes,
and Is it the 8th of March?
Yeah. Well, I might have the day wrong. I don't think it's tomorrow. But on Wednesday, I know what I'm doing on Wednesday. We have like at least a week of events. Okay. So while it is the 8th of March, we tend to do things throughout the week, and the week before and the week after that, and it just keeps. So one of the things that I'll be involved in is I'm going to a big meeting in person of a lot of women entrepreneurs, where we're going to celebrate the support that we've been giving each other, and to women who are setting up new businesses and new ideas. So we're going to have a big, exciting, because we're going to be together, physically together, because a lot of our, our meetings have been, of course, on screen. Yes. So that's going to be quite a party. So I'm really looking forward to that. And we'll have some talks, but that will be very much a celebration. And other things that, will be happening in every sector. All women's organisations will be running meetings, and mostly the point is to celebrate, but also there's always time set aside to reset the agenda and make sure that we're on track. What are the changes? What are the new things that are ahead? What if there's groups? How do people feel? What do they want to see happen in the future, in the year coming? So it's it's kind of like, we do this a lot though. So International Women's Day is very special because it's international. Yes. But it's always, I think, something that we're mindful of celebrating women's work, women's contribution, and the gains that we've made and the work ahead. Yeah, I think it's going to be cool. It's going to be a good week.
Yes, the same here. I think you can also, in every newspaper there are themes about women and gender issues. So it's it's really visible. And of course, the point of our museum is to make it visible all year. but this is a really good day where we can really mark it fully. So I look forward to it. We have also a huge program in Denmark. Yeah, but so nice to see you. And again, you are completely right. The technology has made so much possible. For example, talking to the other side of the globe as we do now. I hope that we will speak again. I think we will stay in contact. We have done so far. So it was so nice to hear you talk. Have a great week, Gill, and I will stop the recording now, and I will finish off afterwards. So thank you, and thank you all of you who has been listening, and have a great International Women's Day, all of you. Yeah. I will stop the recording now. Yay!